the war in 1941. So during this time period, Germany did begin to rearm. Various things that they did. So one of the first things for you to be aware of is that in 1933, Hitler left the League of Nations Disarmament Conference, and this was probably one of the first big things that Germany did to rebel against the Treaty of Versailles, and Germany also left the League of Nations. Remember, they'd been allowed to join the League of Nations in 1926. From this, there was what was called the Dollfuss Affair, and this was when Hitler essentially tried to undermine what was happening in Austria. And Dollfuss was the Austrian leader, the Austrian chancellor, and basically Hitler encouraged the Austrian Nazis to create chaos within Austria, and Dollfuss was eventually murdered. However, Hitler wasn't strong enough to unite with Austria during this time, and this was partly because the Austrian army supported the government, but also Mussolini, who, remember, was an ally of Britain and France at this time, basically forced Hitler to back down. So it shows that by this stage Hitler wasn't powerful or significant in terms of what he could do foreign policy wise. The Saar plebiscite is like a referendum, so the people in the Saar were able to vote in 1935 about whether they wanted to be ruled by Germany or France. The Saar had been given to the League of Nations for 15 years under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. But 90% of people in the Saar industrial area voted to rejoin Germany. So it's a great propaganda victory for the Nazis. March 1935, Hitler began to show off some of the weapons that he was building, some of the troops that he had, started to expand his army, openly defying the Treaty of Versailles. So we're starting to see him becoming more confident and more aggressive by this time. So much so that in April 1935, Britain, France and Italy signed what was called the Stresa Front. Now, the Stresa Front basically was an agreement between Britain, France and Italy to sort of work together and to unite their efforts really against Nazi Germany. Partially successful, but Mussolini was already starting by this stage to prove to be an unreliable ally. We know about the Abyssinian crisis from looking at the League of Nations as well. This is a really significant event, June 1935, the Anglo-German Naval Agreement, because what we see here is that Britain is acting on its own. And basically, Britain signs a navy agreement with Germany, basically allowing Hitler to build up his navy to around 35% of the size of the British one. And this was all about the British wanting to keep naval supremacy. But by allowing this agreement, it completely ripped up the Treaty of Versailles. And because Britain acted what we call unilaterally on its own, didn't consult with France and Italy, it caused huge tensions between Britain with France and Italy, and of course undermined the relatively new Stresa Front agreement that had been signed earlier on in the year. This was also a huge issue for the League of Nations, which was becoming largely irrelevant by this time. So we go on to the reoccupation of the Rhineland in March 1936. Now this, I would argue, is a highly significant event in the road to war. Some historians argue actually this was the last opportunity to actually stop Hitler, but Hitler was allowed to march into the Rhineland. Hitler wasn't particularly powerful in his foreign policy at this time. In fact, some of the soldiers were actually arrived on bikes because the German army wasn't particularly equipped. But Hitler was able to enter the Rhineland, and this was an area that was supposed to be demilitarized under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. But Hitler marched in 1936. Very significant. Britain and France, neither side were able to stop the reoccupation. Within Britain, many people felt that Hitler had the right to go into this territory. They were dealing with the Abyssinian crisis. They felt Hitler was just reclaiming his own territory, so there was no need for Britain to step in. In France, they were fighting an election. They were also dealing with the Abyssinian situation. So neither Britain or France stopped that reoccupation. And Adolf Hitler would later comment that if the French had taken any action, we would have been easily defeated. Our resistance would have been over in a few days. But nobody did take that action. And that's why many historians argue that this was the last opportunity, really, to stop Hitler in his tracks in terms of aggressive foreign policy. So I would argue that the Rhineland occupation was really significant. It really allowed Hitler to grow in confidence. It allowed him to refocus on his desire to unite with Austria, the Anschluss, which would take place in 1938. Very, very importantly and significantly, Britain and France from 1936 begin to rearm. Particularly France begins to build up its defences on its border with Germany, and there starts to be the rumblings of conflict and war. People start to see the signs of war come in. Very significantly as well, Mussolini begins to ally with Hitler. They sign a pact called the Rome-Berlin Axis. Mussolini is starting to look at Hitler and think he might be a more reliable and stronger ally than Britain and France. And because Hitler is able to re-strengthen his borders in the west and not worry about the west by reoccupying the Rhineland, allows him to focus on his plans to expand German territory in the east. And of course that will eventually lead in the late 1930s to conflict within Czechoslovakia and Poland. Winston Churchill would comment about the significance of the reoccupation of the Rhineland, and he was very, very critical that Hitler was allowed to get away with it. So that's basically some of the key information about Hitler's foreign policy. So we know that when Hitler became Chancellor, he wanted to make Germany a strong country again and overturn Versailles. Britain, France, USA and the Soviet Union all had reasons for not wanting to stop Hitler or not being able to stop Hitler at that time. Hitler continued to test the Treaty of Versailles. The reoccupation of the Rhineland, highly significant, and the relationship between the Allies began to break up. Britain and France became more tense, especially after that Anglo-German naval agreement. Italy began to ally with Germany, and the League of Nations had lost authority, and these early years were highly significant in the road to war. So hopefully that fills you in on some of the key information we're looking at. Thank you very much for listening. Hope you're all well and getting on okay with your work. If you've got any questions, just pop me a message on the Teams. But thank you very much. Bye bye.